In 2005, Susan Reverby, a historian at a small women's college in Massachusetts, sat down in a university archive to read the private papers of a doctor who had been dead for 2 years. She was looking for one thing and found another. Buried in his files was the complete record of an experiment her own government had spent more than half a century saying nothing about: real subjects, no consent, and a start date that should not have been possible. The doctor's name was John Charles Cutler, an officer of the United States Public Health Service. The records she found were real, and they were American. In the late 1940s, Cutler's team deliberately exposed people in Guatemala to syphilis and gonorrhea to test penicillin. None of them consented. None of them were told. The documents sat sealed in a private archive until Reverby read them, and the federal government would not apologize until 2010. But the detail that matters most is not what was done. It is when it began. Because in those same months, in a courtroom in Germany, the United States was prosecuting other doctors for doing exactly this and writing the rule that was supposed to make it impossible ever again. Start with the trial, because the trial is where the rule was born. On the 9th of December, 1946, in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, an American military tribunal opened the first of 12 cases against the professionals of the Third Reich. It was not the famous trial of the generals and the ministers. It was the one that came after, and its defendants were doctors. 20 physicians and 3 administrators, 23 in all, stood accused of turning medicine into an instrument of the state. The charges were specific: prisoners frozen in tanks of ice water to study hypothermia, inmates forced to drink seawater, healthy people infected with typhus so vaccines could be tested on the dying. This was not rumor. It was documented in the defendants' own reports, in their own meticulous record-keeping. The prosecution was led by an American, Telford Taylor. Among the expert witnesses was an American physician, Andrew Ivy, brought in to state what medicine was supposed to be. On the 20th of August, 1947, the judges delivered their verdict. 16 of the 23 were convicted. 7 were sentenced to death and hanged the following June at Landsberg Prison. Among them Karl Brandt, once Adolf Hitler's personal doctor. But the verdict was not the most important thing the tribunal produced. Buried inside the judgment were 10 numbered principles, written so that what these men had done could never again be called science. History would name them the Nuremberg Code. And the first principle left no room. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. 10 words: voluntary, absolutely, essential. Here is the part that should make you stop. The court that wrote those words was American. The standard was authored, championed, and imposed by the United States upon the defeated. It was, in every sense, an American rule for a German crime. Now hold that thought, because in the same season the judges were drafting that sentence. A doctor on the American payroll was already breaking it. In 1946, the year the doctor's trial opened, John Cutler was sent to Guatemala. His assignment had practical military value. Could penicillin, given quickly, prevent syphilis after exposure? To answer it, his team needed people to expose. So they created infection on purpose. They paid sex workers already carrying the disease to have contact with prisoners. When that did not reliably transmit it, they applied the bacteria directly. The subjects were inmates of a national prison, soldiers in an army barracks, and patients in the country's only psychiatric hospital. More than 1,300 people were deliberately exposed. Hundreds were infected. None were asked. The institutions were paid in medical supplies for their cooperation. This was the experiment Susan Reverby found nearly 60 years later in a box of papers Cutler had donated to the University of Pittsburgh. She had gone looking for material on a different study entirely. What she pulled from the archive was a record so complete, so clinical, that once the federal government reviewed it, it could not characterize the work as anything other than what it was. Read those dates again. The Guatemala experiments ran from 1946 to 1948. The Nuremberg judgment came down in August 1947. They overlap. For a period of months, the same government was, in one room, condemning physicians for non-consensual experimentation, and in another hemisphere, funding it. The author of the rule was its first violator, and it knew the dates because it set them. In October 2010, the President of the United States telephoned the President of Guatemala to apologize. A federal bioethics commission was convened, and it titled its report with a phrase a researcher had used decades earlier in refusing to take part, ethically impossible. And if that were the only file, this would be a story about one doctor. It is not, because Cutler did not disappear after Guatemala. He went home and joined a study already running on American soil, on American citizens. The study was in Macon County, Alabama, and it had begun in 1932. The Public Health Service had enrolled roughly 600 Black men, most of them poor sharecroppers, about 399 who had syphilis, and a control group who did not. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood. They were not being treated at all. They were being watched so researchers could document what untreated syphilis does to the body over a lifetime. Then, the world changed. By the late 1940s, penicillin had become the standard, reliable cure. It was available, it was cheap, and it was deliberately withheld because curing the men would have ended the experiment. The watching continued for another 2 decades, 20 more years. It did not stop on its own. It stopped because of one man. Peter Buxton was a venereal disease investigator for the Public Health Service in San Francisco. In 1966, he learned what the Tuskegee Study actually was and filed his objection in writing. The agency reviewed it and chose to continue. He filed again. He was told, in effect, that this was above his authority. So, in 1972, he took what he knew to a journalist, and on the 25th of July, the Associated Press put it on the front page. Only then did it end. Now widen the frame because the pattern is not confined to syphilis. Between 1945 and 1947, doctors working for the Manhattan Project injected 18 people with plutonium to measure how the body absorbs it. The first was Eb Cade, a cement worker hospitalized after a car accident in Tennessee, injected in April 1945 without his knowledge. The subjects were chosen because their doctors believed they would die soon. Several lived for decades, carrying a metal no one had told them was inside them. That program stayed hidden for almost 50 years, until a reporter named Eileen Welsum traced the code-numbered patients back to their real names and published them in 1993. A presidential committee working from newly declassified files confirmed the essentials 2 years later. And still, the largest of these programs has not even been named. It did not come from a hospital. It came from an intelligence agency. In 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency authorized a program to study the chemistry of the human mind, whether a person could be interrogated, conditioned, or broken with drugs. It was called MKUltra, and it was run by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Over 20 years, it reached at least 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, through front organizations that concealed where the money came from. Surviving records account for 149 separate subprojects. Its subjects were often unwitting. One of them, an Army biochemist named Frank Olson, was given LSD without his knowledge at a retreat in 1953. Days later, he was dead after a fall from a New York hotel window that his family spent decades trying to understand. Then, the files vanished. In 1973, as scrutiny of the intelligence agencies mounted, Gottlieb obtained authorization from the retiring director, Richard Helms, and ordered the program's records destroyed. They were incinerated. Almost the entire documentary trail of 20 years of experimentation was erased before any investigator could read it. Almost. In 1977, during a search prompted by a Freedom of Information request, an employee found 7 boxes that had been misfiled in a different building and escaped the shredder, roughly 20,000 pages of financial records. That accident is the reason any of MKUltra is known at all. The surviving paper entered the congressional record, not because the agency confessed, but because a clerk had once filed a box in the wrong place. That is not the absence of evidence. That is the deliberate manufacture of it, which raises the question the whole story has been circling. If the rule was this clear, and the violations this many, this large, this consistent, well, why did the code never stop any of it? The answer comes from inside American medicine itself. In 1966, a respected Harvard anesthesiologist named Henry Beecher published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. He did not editorialize. He simply listed 22 studies drawn from mainstream, well-funded, reputable American research, in which patients had been used as subjects without meaningful consent. His point was not that a few bad actors existed. His point was that this was ordinary. It was being published openly, in the best journals, by the best institutions, and almost no one had objected. So why did the Nuremberg Code fail to prevent any of it? The plain answer is that, in the United States, the code was never treated as law. It was understood as a verdict against Germans, a description of foreign atrocity, not a rule that bound American researchers. It carried no enforcement, no penalty, no inspector. A rule no one is required to follow is not a rule. It is a preference. What finally changed things was not conscience. It was exposure. When Tuskegee reached the front page in 1972, the public reaction forced Congress to act. In 1974, it passed the National Research Act, which created the commission that wrote the Belmont Report and built the system of ethics boards that now reviews human research in the United States. Informed consent became a legal requirement, not in 1947, when the code was written, but in the 1970s, when the violations could no longer be hidden. The code did not come home for 27 years, and it came home only because people read the files. 80 years ago, an American court told the world that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. It was right. It is still right. That is what makes the rest of the record so hard to hold. The same government that authored the rule was breaking it in Guatemala while the ink was still wet. It broke it in Alabama for 40 years. It broke it in hospital wards with plutonium and in safe houses with LSD. And when the questions finally came, it burned the paper rather than answer them. The code did not fail because it was weak or unclear. It failed because the institutions that wrote it never believed it described them. It was a rule for other people. The documents exist now. They sit in the National Archives, in university collections, in the boxes a clerk misfiled and a historian refused to put down. The consent form a patient signs today exists because someone, eventually, read the file that was meant to stay sealed. The trial is 80 years old. The principle is 80 years old. The habit it was written to end is older, and it does not announce itself. It waits to see who is willing to read.